How to steal a country without even noticing. Imagine waking up to discover your country has been quietly taken over. Not by force, but through a series of subtle, calculated moves that no one noticed until it was too late. No invasions, no battles. Just a methodical heist pulled off in plain sight. It might sound like a thriller, but it's real. And history's greatest empires, like the British and the United States, have mastered this art. Today, we're breaking down the 6 steps they use to steal nations without anyone even realizing it. First things first, you can't just waltz into a country and declare yourself the new boss. Nope, that would be too obvious. What you need is a long-term plan. Something subtle. Something that'll leave everyone scratching their heads and asking, wait, when did this happen? You know, like how the British East India Company began its operations in India. Step 1, start small. Every great heist begins with something simple, something no one will notice. When the British first arrived in India in the early 1600s, they didn't come with an army. They came with a company, a trading company to be exact. The East India Company began by securing trading rights and establishing small outposts along the coast. These outposts were just commercial hubs, nothing to worry about, right? It wasn't like they were planning to take over the entire subcontinent. But here's the kicker. As the company grew wealthier, it began to establish its own private army. What started as a few merchants and clerks soon included soldiers and fortresses. And by the time the Indian princes realized what was happening, the East India Company was not just a trading partner. It was a de facto ruler. It's the classic foot-in-the-door technique. Start small, and before anyone knows it, you're running the show. Step 2, befriend the local elites. But how do you get to the point where you can start signing contracts and building armies in a foreign land? Simple. You befriend the local elites. The British were masters of this tactic. They didn't conquer India outright. They co-opted. They identified local rulers who were either weak or ambitious and offered them protection, wealth, or simply a seat at the British table. Take the case of the Nizam of Hyderabad. When faced with threats from rival kingdoms and internal revolts, the Nizam turned to the British for help. In return for their military support, he granted the British more land and influence in his kingdom. Slowly but surely, the British entrenched themselves in the Indian political system, playing local rulers against each other while expanding their own control. The United States used a similar tactic during the Cold War. In many parts of Latin America, the U.S. government supported dictators and military regimes that were willing to align with American interests. From Nicaragua's Somoza family to Chile's Pinochet, the U.S. befriended local elites, offering military aid and economic support in exchange for loyalty. The locals thought they were securing their power, but in reality, they were handing over the keys to their countries. Step 3, control the narrative. Now that you've got the elites on your side, you move on to the next step, control the narrative. The British didn't just conquer India through force. They won the hearts and minds of many Indians, or at least enough to keep the resistance manageable. How? By controlling the narrative. The British established English language schools, promoted their culture, and even co-opted local traditions to suit their needs. The introduction of Western education created a class of English-speaking Indians who were often more British in their thinking than Indian. This educated elite became an unwitting ally of British rule, believing that the British were bringing progress and civilization to India. Similarly, the United States used the power of media and propaganda to shape perceptions during the Cold War. In countries like Iran, where the U.S. orchestrated the overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, the narrative was that Mossadegh was a communist sympathizer who threatened the stability of the region. Never mind that he was democratically elected and popular among his people. The important thing was that the story fit the American agenda. Hollywood too played its part. Films and TV shows from the mid-20th century often depicted America as the bastion of freedom and democracy, while the rest of the world was either backward or in need of saving. By controlling the narrative, the U.S. could justify its interventions abroad as acts of benevolence rather than imperialism. Step 4, solidify your power through the democratic process. With the elites and the media in your corner, the next logical step is to solidify your power through the democratic process. But remember, democracy doesn't have to be genuine, it just has to look genuine. The British understood this well when they began implementing so-called democratic institutions in their colonies. In India, the British introduced legislative councils and local self-governments, but with a catch: they controlled the rules. The franchise was limited, and the councils were often dominated by British appointees or allies. The illusion of democracy kept the Indian populace somewhat pacified, while real power remained firmly in British hands. The United States perfected this tactic in the 20th century. In countries like Vietnam, South Korea, and various Latin American states, the U.S. supported elections, so long as the right people won. When the wrong candidate appeared to be gaining traction, as in the case of Salvador Allende in Chile, the U.S. had no qualms about orchestrating coups to set things right. Allende was replaced by Augusto Pinochet, a military dictator who aligned with U.S. interests. And just like that, democracy was restored, at least in name. Step 5. Rewrite the rules. Eventually, someone will start to notice that all these little pieces are adding up to a big fat takeover. That's where Step 5 comes in. Rewrite the rules to suit your needs. The British were experts at this. When faced with resistance in India, they enacted laws that gave them sweeping powers to suppress dissent. The infamous Rowlatt Act of 1919 allowed the British to imprison anyone suspected of sedition without trial. It wasn't just about maintaining order. It was about rewriting the rules to maintain control. The United States has its own history of rule rewriting, often through economic means. Take the case of post-World War II Japan. After the war, the U.S. occupied Japan and implemented sweeping changes to the country's constitution and economy. The new constitution, written with significant input from American officials, included provisions that ensured Japan would remain a close ally of the U.S., particularly in terms of its defense policies. Similarly, in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. rewrote the rules following military interventions. Now, constitutions were drafted and economic policies were restructured to align more closely with American interests. The goal was to create a system where the U.S. had lasting influence, even after it officially left. Step 6. Maintain the illusion of choice. By now, you've got the elites, the media, the politicians, and the legal system in your back pocket. You're practically there. But there's one final piece to this puzzle. Maintain the illusion of choice. Keep the opposition weak and divided, but never eliminate it entirely. This is where the British excelled. In India, they allowed the existence of political parties and movements, but they kept them fractured and under surveillance. The Indian National Congress, the party that eventually led the fight for independence, was often manipulated and split by the British. Leaders were arrested or co-opted, and internal divisions were encouraged. The British allowed just enough dissent to make it seem like Indians had a say, but not enough to actually threaten their control. The United States has followed a similar playbook, especially during the Cold War. In countries where communist or socialist parties gained popularity, the U.S. supported opposition groups, sometimes even funding and arming them. The goal wasn't necessarily to create a thriving democracy, but to ensure that no single group could challenge American influence. In the end, the game is about control, not outright domination. By maintaining the illusion of choice, you keep the population divided, ensuring that real power remains where you want it. So there you have it, a masterclass in how to steal a country without anyone noticing. It's a delicate dance, one that requires patience, finesse, and a healthy dose of charm. But if you can pull it off, you'll find yourself in possession of something far more valuable than gold or diamonds. After all, what's a few billion in the bank compared to having an entire nation at your command? Of course, this is all just historical analysis. We're not suggesting that anyone would actually try to do this today, right? But the next time you see a new foreign investment, a sudden change in government, or a narrative that just doesn't quite add up, take a moment to ask yourself, who's really pulling the strings? Because, as history has shown, the playbook for stealing a country is tried and true, and it's all in the name of progress.